Join me on my journey through the Rory Gilmore reading list, where I tackle the over 400 books mentioned in the original 7 seasons of the Gilmore Girls series. From Shakespeare and Jane Austen to Dr. Seuss and Nora Ephron, the list includes a little bit of everything. Let's get reading. Hello, and welcome back to my little corner of YouTube. Once again, it's been more than a month since I posted, so my discussion today will include my reading experience for both February and March, hopefully succinctly. Gonna try to keep this video from getting too long. Since I last posted, I've read 4 additional books on the Rory Gilmore reading list, as well as 4 bonus books. So took a relatively significant detour over the past couple of months in terms of my reading, but had some fun along the way. I'm going to break from my usual pattern and discuss my bonus books first. So the first book that I read in February was, like millions of other internet girlies out there, Onyx Storm. And I think the internet has said almost everything there is to be said about that book, so I'm not going to discuss it overly much. I would say that my major recommendation is for those of you who haven't read it yet and have been following the Fourth Wing series, be sure to give yourself a little refresher before diving into Onyx Storm, unless you've read the other books really recently. I didn't do a refresher, and that, I don't even think a full reread would be necessary, of course, but maybe just kind of reminding yourself the main characters, watching a little summary video on YouTube, that kind of thing. I didn't do that, perhaps because I assumed that the book and the cast of characters were kind of simple and straightforward enough that I didn't need a reminder, and I regretted it because I spent about a third of the novel feeling a little bit disoriented and wanting to grab my phone to remind myself, oh, who is this character again? Or less so that I forgot entire characters and more oh, where did these characters leave off and what was kind of the resolution of that subplot or that relationship. So I would say that the author dropped the ball a little bit on providing context. I think really great series writers manage to provide that context and that refresher as the story unfolds in a way that doesn't interrupt the narrative, but still acknowledges the fact that there has been time and space between the reader's experience of those characters. And I think that perhaps the strange and modern phenomena of the insane popularity of those kind of book series and also perhaps a rush to get it published meant that just wasn't done as thoroughly as it could have been. So the next book that I read in February was actually one that I mentioned in my last video. I believe I had started it when I started recording that book, and that was this Stories of English by David Crystal. So I think I mentioned that I was really inspired after listening to Beowulf to explore more about the origins of English and the cultures and languages that kind of have fed into the modern iteration of the language, and that is what this book is about. I really enjoyed the read. It was not a super light read, relatively niche nonfiction book and relatively heavy and academic, although the author David Crystal does a nice job of keeping his language lively and providing anecdotes that are, interesting. So I would definitely recommend this to folks who have an interest, academic or otherwise, in the evolution of language in general and specifically English, but wasn't exactly a beach read and maybe not be of interest broadly. The next bonus book that I read over the past couple of months was Everything I Know About Love by Dolly Alderton. I really enjoyed this. This was almost a 5-star read for me. I think I mentioned before I'm not a huge fan of the star rating system, but I debated. So I usually only rank 5 stars and don't bother with anything other than that. And 5-star for me is an unequivocal recommendation book that I couldn't put down, couldn't stop thinking about, and also books that as an editor I don't have any quibbles with. I considered this one 4 or 5 star, but I did have a couple quibbles and some stylistic choices or inclusions in the book that pulled me out of the narrative and pulled me away from thinking about the really insightful takeaways that I think the author includes. So it wasn't quite a 5 star read for me, but very close. Highly, highly recommend. I actually sent messages to a couple of my close friends who are in book clubs and told them if their book club is interested in taking a break from fiction and doing a little memoir, I think this would be a really fun one. It's a nice combination of kind of juicy, like almost a little bit gossipy, and fun to read. It could definitely be a beach read, but it isn't only that. There's a lot of richness and fascinating self-reflection, and most enjoyable for me, truly heartfelt celebration of female friendship. And as you can assume from the title, Everything I Know About Love, a lot of the stories and anecdotes and reflections are about Dolly's romantic life, and where she kind of ends is meditating on how our culture, especially our modern culture, kind of emphasizes romantic love over other forms of love, and how she spent a couple years in her 20s really underestimating and undervaluing how wonderful the love that she had with her close circle of friends was, and how well they supported each other. So I really enjoyed it for that reason as well, and would think that would make it good book club fodder. So highly recommend. Okay, and then my final bonus read for February and March is probably the single biggest reason that it took me so long to get to this movie, to making this video movie. I'm such an old lady. And that is Wind and Truth by Brandon Sanderson. I foolishly took a assignment to write a study guide for this book, and it took me forever. For those of you who are not familiar with this series or this book in particular, this book is 1,400 pages long. The audiobook was 62 hours. And I was laughing because in my last video, I was describing how it took me so long to get through the Count of Monte Cristo audiobook, which was 44 hours. 62 hours, people. I just want to compare this, let's just compare this to, okay, this memoir was like a regular length memoir, yeah? 350 pages. Also, look how much smaller the pages are. It was just, I'm belaboring my point, but I think I'm doing, also look how small the text is. I'm belaboring my point, and I realize that I sound a little bit basic complaining about how long a book is, but I think I'm just needing a little bit of empathy for having made it through that book. Not once, but twice. Because to write a well thought out, detailed study guide on a book, you cannot just read it once. So my usual workflow for my study guides, quick little tangent here, is I usually listen to the audiobook because it's really helpful for me to get the full trajectory of the plot in my mind and start thinking about themes and motifs and things like that, because then when I write my detailed summaries and analysis of each of the chapters, I already have those big picture concepts in mind and am able to then discuss them thoughtfully throughout my study guide. So usually I listen to the audiobook first, and then because I need to write detailed summaries of each chapter, I essentially reread it to write each of those summaries. So it took me a very long time to write this study guide, and I put enough effort and time into it that I think I'm going to do a little video series on this book, also because it's very popular. Brandon Sanderson is the name in modern fantasy writing, I would say current fantasy writing. This book came out at the end of 2024, so everyone's, just reading it now or just having finished it. There's a lot of chatter online about this book. which I'm sure you've seen if you're a fantasy reader. So I think there is enough to be said and enough interest that I will talk more in detail about this book in other videos. But yes, suffice it to say, Brandon Sanderson is the reason this video is so late. And, my takeaway, I actually joked that I was belaboring the point about the length by showing you the book in detail like that, but I actually don't think I am, because even though it sounds very simplistic, I think my takeaway from this book is edit, people. This book is too long. It's too long. It is overwhelming to the point of being unpleasant. And I had, I like long books. I think you've all probably realized by now I like to read. I love a series. It brings me so much joy and pleasure to start a book knowing that there are more books in the series, because I love the experience of getting to spend a lot of time with characters, watching them grow. I love the experience of diving into a fictional world, especially a fantasy world, and really living in it. So I really enjoy series. I really enjoy long books when they're done well and when they deserve to be as long as they are. It is presumptuous and borderline insulting to write a book this long, especially because this is the 5th book in a series that the author intends to be 10 books. It's just too much. And I had the final realization that it was too long when I was discussing this book with a friend who, I should add, enjoyed it more than I did. And I was telling her, like, oh, I had just finished the audiobook and I was on my second read and I was writing about it. So, we were talking about it. And she asked me, do you think taking this study guide assignment so that you have to spend so much time thinking about the book, do you think that ruined it for you? And I think she was onto something, that, maybe I was feeling frustrated with it because I was having to think about it so much. And so I said, yeah, you're probably right. It's kind of a bummer. And then later, after I left her, I realized it should not ruin a book to be thinking about it more. Great books and great stories should get better, more enjoyable, more exciting, more fulfilling the more you think about them. That's why we don't love stories because they distract us and then we can walk away from them and never think about them again. Those are the stories that we forget. That's by nature of what I just said. Like, I think that was a sign that there is an issue here, people. If meditating on it, writing about it, thinking about it, analyzing it ruined it for me, then it's not a great story. I think that's the first book that I've really shit on in these YouTube videos, and fortunately I don't have enough followers for the internet to come at me for hating on Brandon Sanderson. And I don't hate him. I am frustrated with him for this book. And I will discuss that more in other videos. Oh, okay. Enough's enough. Let's move on to the books that are actually on the Rory Gilmore reading list. So the first one that I read in February was Catch-22 by Joseph Heller. And this is a beloved kind of classic satire novel of the modern age set during World War II. It's mostly set on an island an Italian island off the coast of Italy, where the main character, Yossarian, and his, I was going to say battalion, I don't know, we'll just go with battalion, is stationed during the war. And as you might suspect, the phrase catch-22 to mean like a logical inconsistency or a circular reasoning originated from this book. And to give you an idea of kind of the tone and voice and type of humor that's in the book, I thought I would read the passage where the concept of catch-22 is first described in the book. So this is a conversation between the main character, Yossarian, and a character named Doc Danica, who is like the army psychiatrist who's stationed with Yossarian's unit. You mean there's a catch? That's Yossarian asking. Sure, there's a catch, Doc Danica replied. Catch 22. Anyone who wants to get out of combat duty isn't really crazy. There was only one catch, and that was catch 22, which specified that a concern for one's own safety in the face of dangers that were real and immediate was the process of a rational mind. Or, is another character named Or, was crazy and could be grounded. All he had to do was ask. And as soon as he did, he would no longer be crazy and would have to fly more missions. Or would be crazy to fly more missions and sane if he didn't. But if he was sane, he had to fly them. If he flew them, he was crazy and didn't have to. But if he didn't want to, he was sane and had to. Yossarian was moved very deeply by the absolute simplicity of this clause of catch 22 and let out a respectful whistle. So that's the first instance of it, and then catch 22 kind of comes up throughout the book. So as you'll see, one of the main kind of tools of absurdity that the author uses in his satire is the concept of circular reasoning or circular logic, and that is my takeaway in essence, what writers can learn from this classic to apply to their own works. And that is that form kind of mirrors function or message. Form mirrors message in catch 22. So the message of the book is about the absurdity of military life and the ceaseless circles of flawed logical reasoning that the military and modern bureaucracy kind of force people into. And one of the ways that the author communicates that concept and that theme is in the structure of the book. So the book is not, the narrative is not told chronologically. It kind of hops around in time. It also hops around in perspective. So you'll see the same event from multiple characters' perspective kind of popping back up all around the book. So in a sense, the narrative kind of has this circular flow to it where you read an event and then you kind of you think you're moving on in time, and then you read about that event again from the perspective of someone else, or you read about it again from the protagonist's perspective, and it's kind of this circular form that follows or evokes or replicates in some way the concept of the absurdity of that kind of circular reasoning that is a catch-22. So I think that's a really fun and creative way to make your readers really feel or experience your message through the form of your writing. And of course, not all of us are going to be writing satires, and not all of us are going to want to be writing about circular logic and thus using a circular narrative structure. But I think it's a really cool thing to think about. Okay, what is the main message or even the tone or the vibe of my book? What do I want readers to feel, maybe subconsciously as they're reading it? And how can I play with form or the structure of the narrative or even the structure of the perspective point of view that I'm writing from to evoke a sense of that? It's almost like a more visceral way to communicate your theme to readers. Okay, I'm stumbling all over myself. I just tried to talk about this book for a couple minutes and kept getting my tongue tied, so we're going to reset and try again. The next book that I read on the Rory reading list over the past couple months was Brick Lane by Monica Ali. This is a novel that was shortlisted for the Booker Prize in 2003, and the author, Monica Ali, was born and raised in Bangladesh before moving to London, and her protagonist, Nazneen, follows a similar life journey. So Nazneen is a Muslim woman who is born in Bangladesh, and then when she's 18, she's married by arranged marriage to a Bangladeshi man who lives in London and is like 15 or 20 years older than her. So when she's very young and has never been out of the country, doesn't speak any English, she's married to a person she doesn't know and moves to London to start her life with him. So the novel follows the next 15 or 20 years of her life. She moves to London in the mid 80s, and then I'd say the novel ends in 2002 or 3 maybe, because 3/4 of the way through the book 9/11 takes place. So that's kind of a good time reference. One of the interesting stylistic choices that Monica Ali uses is, or makes, a choice that she makes, is she does include some letters. So Nazneen has a sister who remains in Bangladesh and lives her whole life in Bangladesh. And Nazneen writes letters to her from time to time. Nazneen's sister doesn't appear anywhere else in the narrative. They live across the world from each other, and we never meet her or see her outside of Nazneen's thoughts about her and then her letters telling us about her life. So she's kind of an off-the-page, sort of unseen character. And yet, because we're reading letters that she's writing to her closest confidant, her sister, we learn a lot about her. And more importantly, I think for the novel, we learn a lot about Nazneen through her sister and through her reactions to her sister and the content of her sister's letters. So I think the letters work as an interesting device to make an unseen character, her sister, felt. So she is unseen, but she's not unfelt. And I think because the novel is so interested in Nazneen's like development as a person and her mental evolution, I think the author realized that her sister is such a huge part of her heart and her past and her current worries that the readers have to know something about her sister and their relationship, even if her sister is unseen. So she found this way to make her sister be a presence in the story, even though her sister isn't really a presence in the story, because that is important and informative for the character. So I feel like that was kind of a tangle. I just had this weird deja vu where like I just read you guys that insane passage about a catch-22, and then I felt like as I was describing the letters, I was like becoming very Heller-esque in my like circular description of why the letters are important. But I hope you got me because I'm done talking about it. Just kidding. But yeah, so for us as writers, I think stepping back from the narrative, the plot events of the narrative, and considering what formative relationships are part of our character's soul. And then if those formative relationships aren't present in the events of the plot, how do we make those formative relationships or the effects of them felt so that the reader can have a richer understanding of our characters? The final two books I read in February and March on the Rory list were The Hobbit and The Fellowship of the Ring. And this is why I wanted to make sure that I mentioned Brandon Sanderson at the beginning of the video, because I knew that I would want to contrast him a bit to Tolkien. And I don't know, maybe some part of me was craving a big fantasy novel, because even before I signed up to do my study guide on Sanderson, I was reading The Hobbit. And then after I finished Sanderson, I was like, I gotta do Fellowship of the Ring. I need to like remind myself that I love fantasy. And I do. And call me stereotypical or basic or whatever, but I fucking love Tolkien. I love Lord of the Rings. And it was very fun to reread The Hobbit and The Fellowship of the Rings. And the whole series is on the list, so I will eventually get to The Two Towers and The Return of the King. I also enjoyed watching all three Hobbit movies, the newer ones. Watch the extended versions, blah, blah, blah. My husband is out of town for a couple of weeks for work, so I've been enjoying watching those in his absence because he was not a fan. I think a lot of people felt this way too, that the Hobbit movies were a little too Disneyified. And it's been interesting for me because I totally felt that when I watched like the first Hobbit movie in theaters and the dwarves started like singing and throwing plates like they were Beauty and the Beast characters. I was like, what the fuck? But go back and reread it or read it anew. For those of you who have not read Tolkien, you may not realize that There are all kinds of songs in this book, in these books. The characters break into song constantly. So actually, in some ways, that was a relatively faithful, if not cheesy, rendition of Tolkien. And after I had this experience, after I watched that movie, when it came out years ago, I reread the book then, and I was like, oh yeah, this kind of like happens a lot. And then it's kind of grown on me as I've like spent more time thinking about it, as a good story should. As a good story should. So anyway, yes, read Hobbit and Fellowship of the Ring. It's also a nice timely mention because yesterday, when I'm filming this, yesterday was March 25th, which is Tolkien Day. So it's like, yeah, a little honorary Tolkien Day. And I think the Tolkien Foundation does like events and charitable donations and stuff on March 25th because that is the day that Frodo threw the ring into the fire and thus defeated Sauron. So there you go. Happy Tolkien Day. In terms of takeaways for writers, I also feel like Tolkien and the Lord of the Rings series are ones that have been discussed to death online. So I don't think I'm really going to spend too much more time on them, except for just to say my personal bit, I guess, because this is my corner of YouTube after all, right? And I am contrasting Tolkien and Sanderson, specifically my reading experience of them. And I struggled so much with Wind and Truth, and I enjoyed Fellowship of the Ring so much after that I wanted to really think deeply about why. And I came up with a couple things. First of all, I am struggling a bit with the scale of Wind and Truth in the sense that, especially this late into the series, I don't want to do any like spoilers or anything, so I won't, but this late into the series, the main conflict is like between gods and for like the fate of the universe. And I find stories on that scale to be very hard to relate to. It's almost like at some point the stakes get so high that they're almost meaningless again. Like it's impossible for me to really wrap my head around like, oh, like gods fight and like a whole planet gets destroyed. And it's like, okay, I don't like, yeah, that's terrible. Then it just, I don't know. I don't think that being on that order are that sympathetic. And I think the stakes are too hard to grasp. And I do struggle with that with a lot of fantasy series because it seems like people sort of think it's almost like when people are writing these really big epic series, that feels like where it has to go. Like it has to go beyond human scale conflicts to sustain a series, and I just don't think that's true. And I find it less engaging. The Lord of the Rings series, of course, like the stakes are high. It's kind of like the stakes are like Middle Earth, planet. We'll call it planet wide. Like that's a big. The stakes are big, but then the central conflicts of the book aren't between god level characters. The central conflicts are like, and the central relationships still feel like immediate and sympathetic and between human or human like characters. So I think part of it for me is Lord of the Rings just manages to be more approachable and compelling in terms of the conflicts and the emotions of the story, which is interesting, I think, to say because a lot of people like Sanderson over other fantasy authors because he writes in a very kind of almost simple language. It's very straightforward. It's very modern language. and people find him accessible on a language front, but I find him less accessible on like a character stakes front. So, pull whatever takeaways you want from that. I think people will disagree with me on that one probably, but that's my take. And then I think the other reason why I love Tolkien and I love Lord of the Rings is they have this coziness to them that is contrasted very sharply with a real darkness. Like the evil in Lord of the Rings is like really evil, and the orcs and stuff are like real gross. They're scary. There's like trolls that like eat people, and like spooky creatures that live under mountains for centuries. And it's like the dark is dark in Lord of the Rings. And then the cozy is so cozy, and they live side by side, and the cozy doesn't ever get lost or drop out. Neither does the darkness. And I think the two contrasting each other makes both of them so much sharper and more poignant. And there isn't really anything cozy or light in Wind and Truth. And there are like moments of romantic connection between characters, and there is some humor. I will give Brandon Sanderson that. He at least tries. With his like characters making like dad jokes and like math jokes and stuff. I'm not being very, very nice to Mr. Sanderson today. So he tries to do it with humor, and I guess for me, at the end of the day, reading is partially just, and great stories are partially about taste. And I guess for me, the contrast of kind of like the coziness and the wholesomeness of, for example, the Hobbits and the culture in the Shire, and kind of that particular breed of British coziness that's like tea time and like smoking your pipe, and like the attention that Tolkien pays to describing like how people sleep and what they eat, and how comfortable they are, and what what their homes feel like, and things like that. I just think it's a really interesting dynamic and contrast, and perhaps goes back to my first point about the stakes feeling really sympathetic, because they feel like what's it about is like characters wanting to protect their home, not in like this grand like, oh, I need to protect my home planet from like a god, but it's like, I want to protect my ability to feel safe and sit on my chair with my cat and read my book. And that's very relatable, and very sympathetic, and has a real human element to it. So there you go. Make sure your story has that human element. No, just kidding. But yeah, that sense of contrast, I think, is something that any story could benefit from. And of course, it will vary widely what the contrast should be. But I really noticed that on my read through this time with Tolkien, the balance of what I'm calling coziness and what I'm calling darkness. And for those of you interested in cozy, Tolkien does it really well. I know I've mentioned this before. I'm personally self-identify with cozy on a very deep level, and the novel that I'm working on is cozy as well, and kind of building that sense of like warmth and home and safety through coziness is something that I'm working on in my own writing. So I think it was nice to revisit Tolkien, who's a master at the British art of cozy. That's just a little side note. I was the publicist for this very cute book when we published it at HarperCollins several years ago. So love me my cozy. All right, that's it for today. Thank you for listening to me vent about Brandon Sanderson and sing the praises of Tolkien among other books today.